It's early afternoon on Friday, August 22nd, a monumental week in American politics with the Democratic Convention. But we're not allowed to talk about politics on this show because Keith gives all his best stuff to Steve Gilmore, leaves me with the scraps. So, Keith, the scraps this week, Apple, you are at your most controversial in defense of big tech, in defense of Apple? Surely not, Keith.
Well, surely not. I don't know about surely not, Andrew. I mean, Apple, I'm kind of a hero worshiper of Apple, so let's declare that.
So am I. I mean,
Apple was dead on its knees, and Bill Gates loaned Steve Jobs $100 million back in the day. It really was going to go bust. And from Jobs going back after he left Next, or Next was acquired, it has now become the world's biggest company, $2 trillion this week, more today.
I accept the miraculous nature of their near-death experience. That's all remarkable, and I think there's no equivalent. No one's doubting that. But now they're throwing their weight around. They're throwing people off their app store. Isn't that completely unacceptable? What happens if that was the week was on the App Store and for some reason or other they threw you off because you were in competition with them?
So here's what it is, Andrew. It's like, let's say you invite me to stay in your house, in your spare bedroom, and you say, but you're not allowed to sleep with my wife and you can't steal anything from me. So I say, great, those are good rules. I'll do that. And then I come to your house and I do sleep with your wife and I steal your wallet. Epic has basically done that to Apple. It's gone into the App Store, agreeing to the rules, and it then secretly put its own billing system inside its app. And the minute Apple found it out, it closed them down. By the way, it did the same to Google, not just Apple. The second they were closed down, and that's, by the way, the logo on this, that funny Apple-looking thing with glasses. The minute they were closed down, they had a video and a lawsuit ready to go. So they basically baited Apple into a lawsuit by breaking Apple's rules. And they're clearly the bad guy here, masquerading as the good guy.
I accept some of that argument, but in terms of the, I don't know what the metaphor or the analogy you use, there's no choice about staying in your house. Yours is the last house left on earth. I have to stay in your house, otherwise I'm going to starve and freeze to death. So I agree it's not acceptable to sleep with your wife or steal your wallet. But the idea of throwing me on the street is also unacceptable.
I honestly don't think Apple wants to throw Epic out. Obviously, Apple makes money from Epic being there, so there's an advantage to Apple. I put a Steve Jobs video in this week's newsletter that Ben Thompson from Stratechery made me aware of, which was Jobs launching the App Store. And you almost have to have been alive writing software then to appreciate what Apple has done. At that time, if you wrote software and you wanted to distribute it to 200 countries for free, there was really no way to do it. Apple launched this App Store and made it free. And as long as your software is free, allowed you for free to distribute the software to everyone in the world that had an App Store and an iPhone or an iPad. And that was a revelation. I mean, billions of dollars have been paid to developers since then. Now, if you charge, then Apple would take on all the credit card risk. They would give you access to the credit cards of all their subscribers and pay you 70% of every dollar taken back to you. And at the time, developers cheered in the aisles of the announcement, and probably still should be cheering, because the only way Epic gets Fortnite in front of Apple's 1 billion users is through the App Store. And it's not unreasonable, just like Walmart charges a bicycle company 30% of the sale price for putting the bike in Walmart, Apple charges 30% for putting your app in the App Store. It doesn't seem unreasonable to me.
I accept all that, but what about the additional responsibility of essentially being the only platform in town, whether it's Apple's App Store, whether it's Facebook's platform for news, whether it's Google's search engine? These companies have life and death power over media companies, over commerce companies, over app companies. And I think that goes with more obligation, more of a moral obligation than simply commercial risk or commercial analysis. Don't you agree?
I don't really agree, because I don't agree with the premise. I mean, there are two mobile platforms in the world.
Come on. I mean, if you're not on Apple, you're dead. Who could survive? What kind of app company can survive if it's not in the App Store, in the Apple App Store?
Actually, globally, Android is bigger. So the Google...
Okay, well, maybe it's bigger, but you still can't. I mean, there's no way that anyone can survive by just being in one or the other.
I think it's true that Apple has built a franchise that I consider personally, and I'm a developer, as an asset to me. Never mind to them. It's an asset to me. So you're right. It would be hard for me to disagree. When I launched Just.me, for example, we coded it in such a way that if we made revenue, it stayed with us 100%. And we did that by not making use of Apple's credit card payment system inside our app. That's an option. You don't have to use Apple's payment system. You can use your own.
But let's get away from Apple for a minute and talk more broadly about I don't know whether you would call it the moral responsibility of these dominant platforms, or the political, civic responsibility. Is they're not just businesses. They control entire industries. It's like Amazon and e-commerce. What happens if Amazon refuse to allow a rival store in their resale store? Then those stores are probably dead.
You know, it's interesting to ask what it is that Apple actually controls. If you look here, this is Ben Evans' graph from this week's newsletter, and he's looking at Apple's market share in 2019. And he looks at, on the left-hand side, units sold of smartphones, which is under 25%. Yeah. Then he looks at the global installed base, which is around 25%. Then the US installed base, which is about 60-ish%. Then the US App Store sales, which is about 75%.
Yeah.
Then US teenager installed base, which is about 80%. And then he looks at the iOS App Store, which of course it owns 100%. So it says, he's making the point that depending on what you think the market is, Apple's share changes. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
That was Google trying to impose itself.
It was. It just shows what whiz-bang tech I've got here. I can put a colorful screen up. So Apple really is not a monopolist, except in the iOS App Store. And the iOS App Store is not a monopolist. So now it does, because they got a clever business model, it does own the lion's share of all the revenue that come from mobile apps. But that's its success. I mean, why would you want to deny it the products of its effort?
Well, I'm going to let you be a real fanboy now, Keith. As everybody knows, this was the week, I think, that Apple's market valuation went up to $2 trillion. Are they still cheap? Are you still buying Apple stock? Should people be buying Apple stock?
You know, I'm not. I definitely don't want to give anyone investment advice, but I think
they'll sue you, right?
There was a lot of analysts speaking this week. One of them was Gene Munster, who isn't in the newsletter. It was on CNBC, but he thinks that Apple can double from where it is now, and it went from 1 trillion to 2 trillion in less than a year, whereas it took its entire lifetime to get to 1 trillion. And it probably will go from 2 to 4 as fast as it went from 1 to 2, as long as it keeps executing. And by the way, he makes the point that this all happened 10 years, it's almost 10 years since Steve Jobs died, that this all happened on Tim Cook's watch when everyone said Apple will stop innovating. The thing is, Jobs did such a good job of innovating that Apple was years ahead and is still years ahead based on the roadmap they already had when he died.
Well, you know, the old cliche, Keith, is when the Uber driver starts talking to you about whether or not Apple's stock is worth $2 or $4 trillion, that's the time to sell. And speaking of Uber and Lyft, that was the week perhaps where the Uber Lyft bubble finally popped. They're off the streets, or they might be off the streets of San Francisco, where they were born, where the apps began. What's your analysis of the seeming crisis this week in the sharing economy, the sharing driving economy?
Well, this is things coming to a head that have been in the works for quite a long time. Actually, late last night, Lyft won a legal case stopping the state of California from imposing the need to turn the drivers into employees. So the newsletter is about 24 hours out of date because it says that all Lyft and Ubers were going to stop today. In fact, they haven't, but they still might next week. And obviously, the big discussion is the one that Malik triggered last week, which is there only two, kind of states, employment or contractor? Is there something in the middle that represents the gig economy state? And the answer right now is no, which means that the legal authorities are trying to force a binary outcome, that these people are employees. I hope they fail, but I fear they might succeed.
Somewhere, our old friend Travis Kalanick is opening his 5th bottle of expensive champagne. He made off like a bandit, and all those early investors in Uber. One day I'd like to write a book about the hundreds of millions of dollars made by those early investors in Uber, what they've done with their money. It's not all bad news, though, in the sharing economy. Airbnb this week announced an IPO, which surprised a lot of people. What's going on there?
Yeah, and it's an unusual IPO. It's called a direct listing. What that means is they are not going to seek to raise money ahead of the IPO. It's interesting. There's really 3 paths to an IPO these days. The one is just a regular IPO, in which case you take your company on a roadshow and you pitch to investors, and Morgan Stanley or whoever else you work with builds a book. And on the day of the IPO, they look at the book and say, well, we got 2 times as much money as we're selling. Therefore, the price is going to be this. Path 2 is a SPAC, a special purpose acquisition company. In that case, you also don't raise money. The money
that's hot this week. Somebody else is coming out in favor of it.
Bill Gurley.
Bill Gurley. So he's a big player. He's a big heavy hitter. So suddenly they're becoming quite kosher, the SPACs.
Well, he makes the point that SPACs are now competitive. So if you're a good company and you announce that you want to partner with a SPAC to go public, you can interview 5 of them and they have to be competitive against each other to get your business. And what is a SPAC? It's a public vehicle sitting with cash in the bank, usually $500 million or more, waiting for a company to merge with, that by merging, the company goes public and gets the cash that's sitting on the balance sheet. And then the third path is a direct listing. That's what Airbnb is doing. That means they've already got enough cash. They don't need to raise cash. They want to make their stock tradable and therefore liquid for both investors and shareholders. So they're doing that. And the rumor is that they're looking for a $64 billion valuation.
And what are they going to do with all the money they raise?
No, they're not going to raise money. That's the whole point of a direct listing. They won't raise any money because they've already raised enough money from private investors. I see. And that, by the way, was typical of the times, that Fidelity and people like Fidelity, BlackRock, will pump money into the company whilst it's private, and then it goes public. It's different than a SPAC, but the end result is you got all this money from private investors. So the end result's kind of similar, but it's a different path. And Airbnb is doing another unusual thing, which is it's asking for a lockup on the shares. So it's doing a direct listing and then saying, but you can't sell the shares. You've got to keep them for at least a certain number of months. That's never been done before.
Well, we've never had the COVID economy before, and I assume that Airbnb is completely vulnerable to the future of COVID or whether there's a vaccine, and a lot of that stuff's completely out of their hands, right?
Correct. It is. Yeah, I just had a COVID test myself earlier today.
And I assume it was negative because otherwise you wouldn't be on the show.
Well, they don't tell you. It takes a few days. But if you, the last 2 weeks on the show, you'll recall I was coughing and not feeling my best. So I thought I'd better get a test in case that was COVID.
Well, the really good news about this week is there's no mention of Paul Graham. He's not in any of the references or any of the articles. And as I requested last week, you do have a link to something by Scott Galloway about the learning economy. And in a peculiar way, it touches on what we were talking about in the first part of the show, these monopolistic platforms. Because in a way, universities are the equivalent of Google or Apple. They control our innovation economy. And that also explains why places like Austin, Palo Alto, Berkeley, Cambridge, Massachusetts, why these places are so full of innovation and startups, Boulder, Colorado as well. What do you make of Scott Galloway's argument that traditional further education is about to be crushed by digital?
Just before I do that, just a shout out to Michael Healy, who's watching the show, and he just said, great show on Telegram. This is our first use of a Telegram chat channel, by the way, for the show. So anyone watching, if you go to that URL, you can interact with us in real time, as we've just proven with Michael. Yeah, education. Did you watch Kamala Harris's VP acceptance speech today?
What did she say?
So she made the point that one of her claims to fame is that she took on one of the most well-known private schools and, quote, closed them down. You know, there is this COVID accelerated point of view that private schools are gouging Americans.
Is this private high school or private universities? College?
Universities, you know, like Harvard, MIT.
Right.
You know, my son's at Syracuse, which is private. I don't think I need to be shy telling you my annual cost of him going there is $75K. Half of that is board and lodging, which we don't have to pay this semester because he's working remotely. The other half is tuition. Now, you know, that's a lot of money for what the service is. And Scott Galloway is saying that COVID shines a light on how ludicrous the entire thing is. And he wants to move education online and make it accessible and cheaper and available to everyone. And I think the wind is in his sails. This is a good moment to be talking about that. Of course, there's lots of software initiatives to do remote learning, and lots of private universities like Stanford are increasingly putting their stuff online and letting people use it for free, but they're not issuing degrees online yet. So it doesn't seem unreasonable that Scott is talking about what the future might look like here.
And faculty, and I think this is one of Scott's points, which I completely agree with him. Faculty have been feudalized with their tenure system. It's one of the most ludicrous parts of the old economy that you're guaranteed a job for life, and you basically don't have to do anything for years.
Yeah, you know, in my old days, I was in favor of tenure because
you wanted it.
No, because my mom was a union rep, and
Yeah.
it seemed like something to protect professors against being fired for differences of opinion or for intellectual or ideological reasons. And it gave them the courage, if you like, to say what they really think and do the research they really want to do. And I still think there's something in that, that intellectual freedom requires certainty of employment. Otherwise, it could go in all kinds of places.
What do you think, if indeed this traditional monopoly is broken up? It's not going to happen immediately, but it could happen over the next 25 years. What's going to be the impact on these regional innovation centers? I would assume that on the one hand, it could undermine places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Austin, Texas. On the other hand, it could enable other places which don't have world-class universities to prosper.
Yeah, well, the key is education is still going to be measured by its quality. So just like you have guests on your Keen On podcast that mean that it's a very high quality product because of the guests you have, that's true of
very, very, very high. You should all watch Keen On, the show.
But that's also true of education. You know, really good professors who do good research are going to be wanted by students more than ones who are underperforming. So it feels to me, as this all unravels, the individual professional is going to become more and more valuable, like musicians are, like politicians are.
That's the old long tail argument. I actually think the reverse is going to happen. If the university education gets really digitalized, you're going to have massive winner-take-all players like MIT and Harvard, who will be the equivalents of Apple or Microsoft or Google. You're going to have the complete decimation of the middle market, and you're going to have a free underclass of colleges and claiming to be colleges and universities, which are usually something akin to the Trump-style scams.
Now I know that you weren't properly listening to me, because weirdly enough, I agree with you. I was just making the point that it'll be done through capturing the talent. And I think you're right that the talent, you know, MIT will go and pay a professor instead of today's salary, 10x that salary, just like soccer teams play the best footballers,
right?
You know, more than they pay the others.
So what will be interesting is what would happen if, let's say, MIT digitalized, and rather than allowing in 20,000 students a year, allowed in 20 million to have the same kind of education. What would be the impact on Cambridge, Mass? I don't know whether that would be good or bad for Cambridge, Mass, or Berkeley, or Palo Alto, or any of these other college towns. As these universities became more and more virtual, we already have that model in San Francisco with Minerva that's sort of pioneering this kind of high-end virtual education.
Well, you know, if the revenue flowed into MIT would pay tax in Massachusetts. And if it got that many students, the tax would be huge, even if the individual students were paying less each. So I don't think it would be bad for the domiciles that these universities exist in. I don't think it would be that bad.
What's your take on the relationship between Stanford and Silicon Valley? How central is Stanford? If Stanford, for one reason or other, disappeared from Palo Alto, what would be the impact on Silicon Valley?
I don't think it would have a major impact on Silicon Valley, because I don't think Stanford, I think it's exaggerated the extent to which Stanford is a catalyst for innovation. The Google example stands out as a good one, but a lot of innovation in the Valley is coming from all over the world. And the real infrastructure here that makes that happen is money, law firms, and employees. So Stanford's part of that, but it's not a major part of it. I think Stanford's more important for Palo Alto, where it pays a lot of money to the council for providing education for the children of all the people that go to Stanford, for example. But it's not that important in the Silicon Valley context. Actually, MIT is as important, and so is Berkeley, and so is Harvard here in the Valley.
Well, finally, Keith, on to tweet of the week that touches on what Jeff Morris has described as the unbundling of Silicon Valley. Apparently, Palantir, who was certainly on one of my favorite companies, not one of most people's favorite companies, one of Peter Thiel's surveillance-style companies, They're moving out of Silicon Valley. I think they're going to Colorado. Firstly, should we be mourning the loss of Palantir in Silicon Valley? And secondly, does it represent the unbundling of Silicon Valley in your view?
Silicon Valley's certainly taken a hit. I saw another stat this week that looked at the number of people leaving San Francisco compared to other major cities in the US since COVID. And it was a significant number outflow as opposed to inflow. So I've seen this before after the bubble burst in 2000.
We've all seen it, yeah, time and time again. All these articles could be sort of just repeated ad nauseum. The end of San Francisco, everyone's leaving, and of course they always come back, and the real estate market seems to hold up very well.
Yeah, and well, so it's basically a Kondratiev curve, isn't it? It's the boom and bust cycle, and you know the popular mythology here is that the real entrepreneurs stay, and the money seekers come and go. And that is probably not altogether inaccurate. And I think Palantir choosing to change its domicile is probably tax driven. I have no idea what the tax regime is in Denver, but Palantir being the kind of company it is, I suspect that might be a big part of the decision.
What's your view on Palantir, by the way? It's out of the news probably on purpose, and they never seem to want anybody to know anything about it. They have close ties to the intelligence community. They are the beating heart of surveillance capitalism, both metaphorically and literally.
It depends on your ideology. I'm a left libertarian, which means that I don't like state interference in anything. I like a small state when it comes to surveillance, and a big state when it comes to things like education and healthcare.
So you're okay if Palantir is watching you all the time. You just don't want the US government to do so.
Well, they're the same thing, aren't they?
Well, so you're against Palantir. You're not a fan.
I'm not a fan, other than as possibly a shareholder. Then I'd be a fan because they're making a lot of money.
And Peter Thiel is, of course, their major backer. He left Silicon Valley to much acclaim, at least locally. A year or two ago, doesn't seem to have had any impact at all.
No, Peter's a quandary to me. I mean, I never understood why he was a Trump supporter in the first place. I don't know how anybody who is trying to change the world for the better can support a narrow Republican point of view myself. But, you know, I'm just me. What do I know?
And finally, changing the subject from Peter Thiel, do you expect the fires in California to have any impact on Silicon Valley? Is the air in Palo Alto as bad this week as it's been in Berkeley?
You know, I was listening. When I went to my COVID test today, I was listening to the radio. There were 120,000 lightning strikes in 24 hours in California that have produced 376 fires. Will it affect Silicon Valley? No. Am I an expert on this stuff? No. But does the air stink? Yes. So our kids are all inside, the windows are all closed, and we got the air conditioning on, which is recirculating internal air.
Well, I think the one thing we can say with confidence is that there will be a That Was the Week next week, although it's actually on a Sunday next week, right?
Yeah, it's going to be late next week, everyone. Sunday for this recording, and that means late Sunday for the newsletter coming out.
I'm driving my daughter across America to start college. If they cancel it, which they may well do in the next few days, then maybe we'll do